Camp Forest, Tennessee, late 1942. Second Lieutenant John George opened a wooden crate marked Fragile. Inside was a Winchester Model 70 hunting rifle, walnut stock, blued steel barrel, and mounted on top, a Lyman Alaskan scope. George had saved 2 years of National Guard pay to buy this rifle. He'd won the Illinois State Shooting Championship with it in 1939. At 23 years old, he'd been the youngest state champion in Illinois history. He lifted the rifle from the crate, 9 pounds. The scope added another 12 ounces. The battalion armorer walked over and looked at it. "What's that for? Deer or Germans?" "Japanese," George replied. The armorer laughed. "You're taking a hunting rifle to war? That thing's a toy." George didn't argue. He just cleaned the cosmoline off the rifle and packed it carefully. The 132nd Infantry Regiment shipped out before George's rifle arrived. He spent the entire ocean voyage watching other men clean their M1 Garand rifles while his own weapon sat in a warehouse in Illinois. He requested it be forwarded through military mail. 6 weeks later, in late December 1942, a supply sergeant handed him the crate. His fellow officers had already nicknamed it. They called it George's mail-order sweetheart. Captain Morris, his company commander, took one look at the civilian hunting rifle and shook his head. "Leave that sporting rifle in your tent. Carry a real weapon." George carried it anyway. He had no idea that in 3 weeks, that toy hunting rifle would do something no military weapon on Guadalcanal had been able to do. If you want to hear the incredible true story of how a civilian hunting rifle became the most feared weapon in the Pacific, hit that subscribe button right now. This is WW2 Documents, where we tell the verified stories others ignore. Let's go. December 1942, Guadalcanal. The 132nd Infantry Regiment had just relieved the Marines who'd been fighting since August. The Marines had taken Hendersonfield. They'd held it, but they hadn't taken Mount Austin, and they hadn't cleared the Japanese from the coastal groves west of the Matanaka River. Mount Austin was the priority, a 1,514-foot hill the Japanese called the Gifu. 500 enemy soldiers, 47 bunkers. George's battalion attacked on December 17th. They fought for 16 straight days, 34 men killed, 279 wounded. By January 2nd, they'd finally taken the western slope. During those 16 days of hell, George had fired his Winchester Model 70 exactly 0 times in combat. His fellow officers' mockery continued. Every time they saw the hunting rifle, they smirked. Every time George mentioned his shooting background, they changed the subject. Then came Point Cruz. The jungle around Point Cruz was different from Mount Austin. No bunkers, no fixed positions. Just massive banyan trees, some reaching 90 feet tall with trunks 8 feet thick. And hiding in those trees were Japanese snipers. These weren't ordinary soldiers. These were trained marksmen with scoped Arisaka Type 98 rifles. They knew the jungle. They knew how to wait. They knew how to kill. On January 19th, a sniper killed Corporal Davis while he was filling canteens at a creek. On January 20th, another sniper killed 2 men from L Company during a patrol. On January 21st, 3 more men died. One of them was shot through the neck from a tree the patrol had walked past twice. In 72 hours, Japanese snipers had killed 14 Americans. The battalion was paralyzed. Men were afraid to move during daylight. Patrols refused to enter the groves. That night, the battalion commander summoned George to headquarters. The commander was direct. "The Japanese snipers are killing my men faster than malaria. Intelligence says there are 11 of them operating in the Point Cruz groves. I need someone who can actually shoot." He looked at George. "I've heard you won some state championship. Is that true?" George nodded. "Illinois State Championship, 1,000 yards, 1939. And that mail-order rifle your men laugh about? Can it actually hit anything?" George explained his credentials. 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights. With the Lyman Alaskan scope, 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards. The commander gave him until morning. You have one chance to prove that toy rifle can kill something besides deer. If you can stop even one of those snipers, I'll let you keep hunting. If you can't, you're going back to a regular infantry platoon with a regular rifle. George spent that night in his tent with the Winchester. He field stripped it completely, checked every component. The rifle had been packed in cosmoline for the ocean voyage. He cleaned it again, even though he'd already cleaned it twice. He loaded 5 rounds of 30-06 hunting ammunition, military ball ammo, the same cartridge the M1 Garand fired, but in his bolt-action Winchester. At dawn, on January 22, 1943, George picked up his hunting rifle and walked toward the Point Cruz groves. His fellow officers watched him go. Some shook their heads, others laughed quietly. None of them thought he'd succeed. George moved into position in the ruins of a Japanese bunker his battalion had captured 3 days earlier. The bunker overlooked the coconut groves west of Point Cruz. He brought no spotter, no radio man, just his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips. The Lyman Alaskan scope had 2.5 power magnification, not much by today's standards, but enough to see movement in tree branches that the naked eye would miss. George settled in and began glassing the trees, left to right, top to bottom, slow and methodical. The jungle was never silent. Birds, insects, distant artillery. George filtered out the noise and focused on movement. At 9:17 a.m., he saw it. A branch moved. No wind, just a small shift. 87 feet up in a banyan tree 240 yards away. George watched. The branch moved again. Then he saw the shape. A man. Dark clothing, positioned in a fork where 3 branches met. The Japanese sniper was facing east, watching the trail where George's battalion had been moving supplies. He had no idea George was watching him from a completely different position. George adjusted his scope. 2 clicks right for wind. He controlled his breathing. The Winchester's trigger was glass smooth, 3.5 pounds. He'd spent hours adjusting it at Camp Perry before the war. Now he would find out if a civilian target rifle could kill a man trained to kill him first. He squeezed the trigger. The Winchester kicked into his shoulder. The sound cracked through the jungle. 240 yards away, the Japanese sniper jerked. His body tumbled through the branches. 90 feet down, he hit the ground near the base of the banyan tree. George worked the bolt, the empty cartridge ejected with a metallic ping. He chambered another round and kept his scope on the tree. 1 shot, 1 kill. But Japanese snipers worked in pairs. 1 shooter, 1 spotter. If George had just killed the shooter, the spotter was somewhere close. George scanned the surrounding trees. At 9:43 a.m., he found the second sniper. Different tree, 60 yards north of the first. This one was lower, maybe 50 feet up. The Japanese soldier was moving down the trunk, retreating. He'd heard the shot and knew his position was compromised. George aimed, led the movement, fired. The second sniper fell backwards off the tree. His rifle clattered through the branches ahead of him. 2 shots, 2 kills. George reloaded from a stripper clip. His hands were steady. This was no different than shooting at Camp Perry, except the targets shot back. At 11:21 a.m., a Japanese bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from George's head. The impact sprayed dirt into his face. He rolled left and pressed himself against the bunker wall. The shot had come from the southwest, different direction than the first 2 snipers. George waited 3 minutes before moving. Then he inched back to his firing position and glassed the trees to the southwest. The shooter would have moved after taking the shot. Basic sniper doctrine. But in jungle this dense, relocation options were limited. George found him at 11:38 a.m. 3rd tree from the left in a cluster of 5 banyans. 73 feet up. The Japanese sniper had repositioned to a different branch but remained in the same tree. A mistake. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired. The third sniper fell without making a sound. By noon, George had killed 5 Japanese snipers. Word spread through the battalion. Men who had mocked his mail-order rifle now asked if they could watch him work. George refused. Spectators drew attention. Attention drew fire. The Japanese snipers adapted after the 5th kill. They stopped moving during daylight. George spent the afternoon glassing trees and seeing nothing. At 4 p.m., he returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting. The mockery was gone from his voice. 5 confirmed kills? Yes, sir. How many rounds fired? 7. 2 misses. Morris stared at him. You killed 5 enemy snipers with 7 rounds from a hunting rifle. Yes, sir. You're back out there at dawn tomorrow. January 23rd began with rain. Heavy tropical rain that turned the jungle floor to mud and made trees invisible beyond 100 yards. George sat in the bunker and waited for the weather to clear. The rain stopped at 8:15 a.m. By 8:45 a.m., visibility had returned. George spotted the first sniper of the day at 9:12 a.m. The Japanese soldier had climbed into position during the rain. Smart. The sound of rain masked movement. This sniper had chosen a tree 290 yards out. Longer range than yesterday. Also smart. They were learning his capabilities. George accounted for distance and fired. The sniper fell. Kill number 6. At 9:57 a.m., Japanese mortars began hitting the area around George's bunker. They had triangulated his position based on muzzle flash or sound. The first rounds landed 40 yards short. The second salvo landed 20 yards short. The third salvo would hit the bunker. George grabbed his rifle and ran. He sprinted north along the tree line and dove into a shell crater. Behind him, the bunker he'd occupied moments earlier disappeared in explosions and flying debris. George relocated to a different position, a fallen tree 120 yards north of the destroyed bunker. He settled in and resumed his watch. The Japanese sent more snipers that afternoon. They knew George was hunting them. They were now hunting him back. This was no longer target shooting. This was a duel. At 2:23 p.m., George killed his 7th sniper. At 3:41 p.m., he killed his 8th. This one had climbed high, 94 feet up a banyan tree. Good concealment, but the height created a silhouette against the sky when the sun angle changed. At 5 p.m., Captain Morris sent a runner to bring George back. George had been in position for 9 hours. Morris wanted numbers. George reported 8 confirmed kills over 2 days. 12 rounds fired. 8 kills, 4 misses. Morris assigned George to continue operations starting at dawn on January 24th. That night, George cleaned his Winchester and considered the mathematics. 11 Japanese snipers operating in the Point Cruz groves. 8 now dead. 3 remaining. Those 3 would be the best, the ones who had survived the longest. And now they knew exactly what George looked like. They knew his rifle. They knew his tactics. George loaded his Winchester with 5 fresh rounds and tried to sleep. At 3 a.m., he gave up. He sat in his tent with the rifle across his lap. The rain started again at 4:15 a.m. By 5:30 a.m., it was heavy enough that dawn operations would be delayed. George used the time to move to a new position. Not the bunker, not the fallen tree, somewhere the Japanese would not expect. He chose a spot 70 yards south of his previous position, a cluster of large rocks the Marines had used as a machine gun nest back in December. The position offered good cover and overlapping fields of fire into the groves. George settled in and waited for the rain to stop. At 7:43 a.m., the rain slowed to a drizzle. Visibility improved. George began glassing trees. At 8:17 a.m. on January 24th, he found sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier was positioned in a palm tree 190 yards out, low, only 40 feet up. Unusual. Most snipers climbed high for better sight lines. George aimed, controlled his breathing, began to squeeze the trigger. Then he stopped. Something was wrong. The position was too obvious, too easy. George had been hunting snipers for 3 days. He'd killed 8 men. The remaining 3 would not make elementary mistakes. They would not position themselves where an elevated shooter could spot them. Unless it was bait. George lowered his rifle and scanned the surrounding trees. If the sniper in the palm was bait, the real shooter would be positioned to cover him, watching for anyone who took the shot, waiting for muzzle flash, ready to return fire. George glassed the trees methodically, left to right, top to bottom. It took 11 minutes. At 8:28 a.m. on January 24th, he found the real threat. A banyan tree 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up. The Japanese sniper was positioned in a perfect hide. Branches and vines concealed him from 3 sides. He had a clear line of sight to George's previous position at the fallen tree. He was waiting for George to appear there or to take a shot at the bait in the palm tree. George had 2 problems. First, the real sniper was watching the wrong location. If George fired at him, the sound would reveal George's actual position. Second, if George did nothing, the sniper would eventually realize George wasn't at the fallen tree and begin searching. George decided to use the bait against them. He aimed at the decoy sniper in the palm tree, adjusted for wind, fired. The decoy sniper jerked and fell. He immediately swung his rifle toward the banyan tree 91 feet up. The real sniper would react to the sound. He would turn toward the sound. That turn would create movement. He saw it. A slight shift. The sniper was repositioning to face George's location. George put the crosshairs on the dark shape and fired before the sniper could fully turn. The real sniper fell. His rifle tumbled after him. 2 shots, 2 kills. But George had revealed his position to anyone else watching. He grabbed his rifle and ammunition and ran. 40 yards east, George dropped into a drainage ditch. At 8:34 a.m., Japanese machine gun fire raked the rocks where he'd been positioned 6 seconds earlier. The bullets kicked up dust and stone fragments. The fire lasted 17 seconds. When it stopped, George counted to 60 before moving. 10 confirmed kills, 1 remaining. The 11th sniper would be the best, the smartest, the most experienced. He had watched 10 of his comrades die over 3 days. He knew George's tactics. He knew his rifle. He knew his approximate location. And somewhere in those trees, he was watching, waiting, planning. George relocated again, this time to a shell crater partially filled with rainwater, 100 yards east. He settled into the crater with water up to his chest, rested the Winchester on the crater rim, resumed glassing trees. At 9:47 a.m., George realized his mistake. The 11th sniper was not in the trees. He was on the ground, and he was moving toward George's position. George saw movement at the edge of his peripheral vision, 60 yards south, low to the ground. A shape moving through undergrowth, parallel to the tree line. The Japanese sniper was using jungle floor vegetation for cover, ferns, vines, fallen branches. He was crawling toward George's last known position at the rocks. George remained motionless in the water-filled crater. The Winchester was already shouldered, but the angle was wrong. The crater rim blocked his view of the approaching sniper. George would have to rise up to get a clear shot. Rising up would expose him. The Japanese sniper stopped at 9:52 a.m. He had reached a position 40 yards from the rocks. George watched through his scope. The sniper was studying the rocks, searching for movement, for any sign of his target. George waited. Patience was the primary skill of sniper work. At 9:58 a.m., the Japanese sniper began moving again. 35 yards from the rocks. 30 yards. 25 yards. At 10:03 a.m., the Japanese sniper reached the rocks. He moved into the machine gun nest and took up a position facing east. His back was exposed to George. Center mass. 38 yards. An easy shot. But George hesitated. This sniper had survived 10 days of American operations. He had outlived 10 other snipers, men who had been killed because they made mistakes. This man would not make mistakes. The position was too exposed, too vulnerable. This had to be another decoy. George kept his scope on the sniper in the rocks, but expanded his awareness to the surrounding area. At 10:06 a.m., George found it. A second Japanese soldier, 70 yards northwest of the rocks, behind a fallen tree trunk. This soldier was not moving, not repositioning, just watching, waiting. His rifle was aimed toward the drainage ditch where George should have been hiding. 2 men, not one. The 11th sniper had brought support. George could not shoot both men before they reacted. The bolt-action Winchester required him to work the action between shots. That gave them time to locate him and return fire. He needed a different approach. George slowly lowered himself deeper into the water. He submerged until only his eyes and the top of his head remained above the surface. He kept the Winchester pointed skyward to keep water out of the barrel. Then he waited. At 10:13 a.m., the Japanese soldier in the rocks stood up. He had spent 10 minutes watching the drainage ditch and seen nothing. He turned and signaled to his partner behind the fallen tree. Both men began moving east, parallel to each other, 70 yards apart. They were executing a sweep, planning to flush George out. George remained in the water, motionless. The Japanese soldiers moved past his crater. They were now between George and the tree line. Their backs were exposed to George. George rose from the water, slowly, silently. Water dripped from the barrel, from his uniform, from his face. He aimed at the closer soldier, 42 yards away. He fired. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt, chambered another round, swung the rifle toward the second soldier. The man was turning, raising his rifle. George fired first. The second soldier fell. 11 shots fired over 4 days. 11 Japanese snipers dead. George had cleared the Point Cruz groves of the threat that had killed 14 Americans in 72 hours. But as George climbed out of the crater, he heard voices. Japanese voices, coming from the tree line. Multiple men moving toward the fallen soldiers. George dropped back into the crater. The Japanese voices grew louder. At least 6 men, maybe more. Infantry. A patrol or recovery team sent to collect the bodies. At 10:28 a.m., the voices began moving toward George's crater. They had found his tracks, boot prints in the mud. At 10:31 a.m., a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater rim. He was looking down, directly at George. Their eyes met. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. George worked the bolt while still submerged, rose up. 2 more soldiers at the crater rim. George fired, worked the bolt, fired again. 3 rounds left. George climbed out of the crater and ran. Japanese rifle fire followed him through the jungle. He sprinted for 90 seconds,
before diving into another shell crater. The Japanese voices were distant now. They had not pursued. At 11:13 a.m., George reached the American perimeter and reported to Captain Morris.
Morris wanted a full debrief. 11 Japanese snipers killed over 4 days. 12 rounds fired against the snipers. 11 hits, 1 miss. Then a firefight with infantry. 3 more kills. Morris asked about the rifle. George said it was functional but needed cleaning. Mud in the action, water in the barrel. Morris told George to rest. The battalion was moving east. The Point Cruz groves were no longer a priority. But word had reached division headquarters. The colonel wanted to see George. Colonel Ferry had one question. Could George train other men to do what he had done? George said he could try, but it would require time, rifles with optics, and men who could already shoot. Ferry said division had 14 Springfield rifles with Underdog scopes, sniper rifles left behind by the Marines. Ferry had 40 men in the regiment who had qualified as expert marksmen. He wanted George to create a sniper section, train the men, develop tactics. George accepted, but he had one condition. He wanted to keep his Winchester. Ferry approved. Over the next month, George trained America's first organized sniper section, 16 two-man teams, shooter and spotter. By February 9th, the section had killed 74 Japanese soldiers, 0 American casualties during sniper operations. On February 7th, George was operating near the Tanamboa River when a Japanese rifleman shot him. The bullet struck his left shoulder. George was evacuated to a field hospital. The wound was serious but not fatal. He would recover. While George recovered, the Japanese completed their evacuation of Guadalcanal. The campaign was over. But George's war was not finished. Orders came from Pacific Command, something in Burma, something classified. George volunteered. By March, he was heading to India. His Winchester Model 70 was packed in the cargo hold. He would join a new unit, 3,000 men. They called themselves Merrill's Marauders. George survived Burma. He survived the war. He returned to the United States in 1947 as a lieutenant colonel. 2 Bronze Stars, 1 Purple Heart. He enrolled at Princeton University on the GI Bill, studied politics, graduated with highest honors. That same year, he wrote a book about his experiences, technical, detailed, clinical descriptions of weapons and tactics. The National Rifle Association convinced him to publish it. The book was titled Shots Fired in Anger. It became a classic, still in print today, still used by firearms historians and collectors. George never spoke publicly about Point Cruz during his lifetime. His colleagues knew he'd served in the Pacific. They didn't know about the 11 snipers. John George died on January 3, 2009. He was 90 years old. The Winchester Model 70 that killed Japanese snipers on Guadalcanal was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. It sits in a display case with a placard describing its history. Most visitors walk past without stopping. It looks like any other vintage hunting rifle. But it's not. It's the rifle that proved a civilian hunting rifle could outperform military weapons. The rifle that cleared Point Cruz in 4 days, when an entire battalion couldn't do it in 2 weeks. The rifle that changed how the American military thought about individual marksmanship. The rifle they called a toy. The rifle they mocked as mail-order garbage. The rifle that killed 11 enemy snipers in 96 hours. This is the verified true story of John George and his Winchester Model 70. Every detail comes from his memoir, military records, and the rifle itself, preserved in a museum. If this story proved that skill and determination matter more than standard equipment, hit that like button right now. Share this video. These forgotten heroes deserve to be remembered. Subscribe to WW2 Documents for authentic World War II stories that don't get told anywhere else. Drop a comment below. Have you ever been mocked for doing something differently, then proved everyone wrong? John George brought a hunting rifle to war. They laughed at him. Then he became Guadalcanal's deadliest sniper. Never underestimate the underdog. Never mock someone for doing things their own way. And never forget the story of the mail-order rifle that proved everyone wrong.